My name is Nick Kocisak, and today I'd like to share with you some of the results of RGA's in-depth analysis on the relationship between opioids and mortality. In 2017, deaths attributable to unintentional poisoning, which includes drug overdoses, exceeded deaths from car accidents by over 60%. This figure comes as a result of a consistent rise in opioid-related mortality since the mid-2000s. In fact, data from the CDC indicates that between 2005 and 2017, drug overdose fatalities have more than doubled. At the same time, the proportion of drug overdose fatalities attributed to opioids has increased from 50% to 70%. With these numbers on the rise, RGA was prompted to conduct an in-depth data-driven analysis on the relationship between opioid use and mortality results. From our research, there are several key takeaways. First, as previously stated, opioid-related mortality has been on the rise over the past decade in the United States. That being said, when you break down mortality results by educational attainment, you'll find that the college-educated population is far less affected by this rise. In fact, in 2017, opioid-related mortality rates for the college-educated population was a mere 1/7 that of those with only a high school diploma. With these figures in mind, it is implied that the insured population, which is generally more educated, is likely less affected by the rising opioid risks. From our prescription analysis, we identified 3 key factors that observe different mortality trends. First, we have the duration and strength of the opioids prescribed. Second, we have insights on the different types of opioids and their different risk profiles. Finally, we have the risks of the interactions between opioids and benzodiazepines. When looked at in isolation, it can appear that the strength of the opioid is the main driver in the trend between all-cause mortality and opioid use. As you increase the strength of the opioids prescribed, all-cause mortality increases as well. However, when you introduce day supply into your analysis, you see different trends by different day supply groups. Individuals prescribed the highest strength opioids for more than 120 days exhibited 4.4 times higher all-cause mortality than all opioid users. That being said, 80% of the opioid-taking population only received opioid fills for less than 31 days. This group observed no increases in mortality regardless of increased opioid strength and had consistently lower all-cause mortality than the general opioid-taking population. The next thing that we looked at was differences in all-cause mortality by the different opioid types. We focused in on oxycodone and hydrocodone, 2 of the most commonly prescribed opioids, and tramadol, which is often thought to be less addictive than other opioids. What we found is that for short-duration users between 1 to 30 days supply, there was relatively no difference in the mortality outcomes. However, once we exceeded 31-day supply, that's where the differences started to show. Oxycodone and hydrocodone had increasing mortality as the duration of prescription increased. Meanwhile, tramadol remained level across increases in opioid prescription duration. Finally, we looked at the interaction between opioids and benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are a depressant commonly used to treat anxiety, depression, insomnia, and more. Similar to opioids, benzodiazepines sedate users and suppress breathing, leading to higher potential for overdose. What we found from our research is that individuals prescribed benzodiazepines consistently exhibited higher mortality results than those without prescriptions of benzodiazepines. That elevated mortality did not remain level amongst opioid features. As the opioid strength and duration prescribed alongside benzodiazepines increased, the elevated mortality also increased. Now, before I get into the detailed results of our study, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on our research. First, all of the drugs' strengths were standardized by morphine milligram equivalent, or MME. It's important to keep in mind that not all opioids were made equal. This is most recognizable in the most extreme cases. For illustration, the shown doses of opioids have the same total opioid strength. Fentanyl can be up to 100 times more potent than morphine, and carfentanil, commonly used as a sedative for large animals, including elephants, it can be up to 10,000 times as potent as morphine. Now, this is an extreme example, and most of the prescribed drugs that we will be looking at are less than 4 times as potent than morphine. However, this example really illustrates the importance of standardizing opioid strength in your analysis. The next piece of background that's necessary is to understand the methodology of our research. In order to be applicable in the insurance industry, we designed our research to replicate an underwriting scenario. With this in mind, we removed individuals whose all-cause mortality results were likely due to causes other than their opioid use. This includes individuals that were suspected of having cancer or being under hospice care. These individuals likely would have been declined for insurance or received high substandard rates regardless of their opioid use and would have biased our results. Further, we standardized the all-cause mortality results by the relative risks observed in the prescription history. This was done in order to isolate the variation in all-cause mortality by opioid-related features only. Our underwriting scenario centers around January 1st, 2015 as our pseudo-underwriting date. We then look back 2 years at some of the prescription history and generate features around a person's opioid use. Using these features, we look forward 3 years at their mortality experience and analyze some of the effects that the prescription features had. The data that we used to conduct this analysis was a mortality-linked prescription history database. This data was anonymous. However, we had a unique identifier that allowed us to link prescription history for a person to their mortality results in the future. Throughout our 2-year observation period, there were 12 million opioid fills for 3.2 million individuals. Of these 3.2 individuals, 15.6 thousand deaths occurred in the following 3 years. What this means is that our data is large and robust and gives us a lot of credibility at the majority of our data points, which you will see in the 95% confidence intervals on all of our charts. Now, before I get into the results here, I want to explain a little bit about this chart. Along the y-axis, you'll see the relative mortality. The relative mortality gives an indication of the ratio of actual deaths to expected deaths and how it relates to the overall population. In this case, opioid users. Along the x-axis, from left to right, we see increasing average daily drug strength. Each line on this graph represents a different duration of opioids prescribed. If you focus in on the red line here, we see that regardless of the increase in average daily opioid strength, there's no increase in relative mortality. This is key because this represents 80% of opioid users. Not only that, but they have consistently lower mortality results than their average opioid user. Next, if you follow the lines from red to yellow to blue, you'll notice that each line progressively gets higher. This is an indication that an increase in the duration of opioids prescribed was associated with elevated mortality results. Finally, if we focus in on our highest point in the top right corner, you can see that individuals prescribed the highest strength opioids for more than 120 days observed 4.4 times higher mortality than the average opioid-taking population. It is important to keep in mind that the opioid strength could be indicative of the severity of any underlying conditions and could be impacting these results here. The next piece that we touched on was the type of opioid. While we discussed standardizing the opioid strength by MME, this isn't a perfect system. Different opioids and their different delivery systems still have different effects on the body. Some of these different effects include the strength of the euphoric effect, the time to take effect, the length of the effect, and the overall addictive and overdose potential. For this reason, we broke down our research to look at 3 major opioids: oxycodone, hydrocodone, and tramadol. What we saw is that for those in the 1 to 30 day supply group, those short-term users, there was relatively no difference in mortality results. However, once we expanded beyond 31 days, that's when we started to notice some big differences. Oxycodone and hydrocodone consistently increased as the duration of opioids prescribed increased. However, those prescribed tramadol, their mortality remained relatively constant regardless of the duration of the prescription of opioids. It is important to note that this does not signify that one drug is safer than the other. There are many reasons that a person might be prescribed one drug over another, and this could be reflected in these results here. The final thing that we looked into was the interaction between opioids and benzodiazepines. According to the National Drug Institute on Drug Abuse, more than 30% of opioid overdoses also involved benzodiazepines. For this reason, RGA was interested in examining the relationship between opioids and benzodiazepines and all-cause mortality. What we found is that individuals prescribed benzodiazepines consistently observed increased mortality results compared to those without a prescription of benzodiazepines. However, this elevated mortality was not level across the opioid features discussed before. As opioid strength and duration increased, the elevated mortality associated with the presence of benzodiazepines increased further. It is important to realize that the prescription of benzodiazepines could be indicative of the severity of some of the underlying conditions a person may have, and that not all of the elevated mortality can be attributed to the use of opioids and benzodiazepines. Throughout our research, we discovered that the relationship between mortality experience and opioid use is complex. However, by taking an objective, data-driven approach, RGA was able to identify 3 key features of opioid use that was associated with different trends in mortality experience. These include the strength and duration of opioids prescribed, the types of opioids prescribed, and the interactions of opioids with benzodiazepines. As a result of this research, we now understand better the relationship between prescription opioid use and all-cause mortality. For more information on this topic, please follow the link provided to our white paper on opioid-related mortality. And with that, I'd like to thank you for watching. Have a good day.